"You're a disgrace." Her father mocked her, until Grandpa stood up and said, "It's time for the truth." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Clara stood frozen at the dining table, her trembling hands clutching the edges of her grandmother's old recipe book, the one she had been poring over for weeks to perfect her baking skills. Her father's voice had cracked through the quiet evening like a whip, each word laced with venom. "You're wasting your life on this nonsense. You'll never amount to anything if all you do is bake pies and dream about some silly little shop." His face was red, his eyes blazing with disappointment that felt as ancient as time itself. Clara's heart thudded painfully against her chest, but she didn't dare look away from him. She knew better than to cry or argue, it only made things worse. Instead, she focused on the worn leather cover of the recipe book, tracing its faded gold lettering with her fingertips. Baking wasn't just a hobby, it was her escape, her sanctuary. In the kitchen, surrounded by flour-dusted countertops and the sweet aroma of cinnamon and sugar, she could forget the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. But here, in this moment, even her safe haven seemed tainted by her father's scorn. Her mother sat silently at the far end of the table, her gaze fixed on the empty plate before her. She always retreated into herself during these outbursts, retreating behind an invisible wall that no one dared breach. Across from Clara, her younger brother Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pretending to be absorbed in the sports highlights flickering on the muted television. He hated these moments too, though he rarely spoke up. No one did, not when their father was like this. But tonight was different. Tonight, something unexpected happened. Before Clara could retreat further into herself, shrinking under the weight of her father's words, a soft yet firm voice cut through the tension. "Enough." It came from the other side of the room, where Grandpa Henry sat in his recliner, the faint glow of the reading lamp casting shadows across his weathered face. His usually calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by a steely resolve that none of them had seen before. Slowly, he rose to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane as he turned to face her father. "It's time for the truth," Grandpa said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Even Clara's father, a man who prided himself on being unshakable, seemed taken aback by the authority in those 5 simple words. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. And then, almost imperceptibly, Grandpa began to speak. "Son," he said, addressing Clara's father directly, "you have no right to speak to her that way. Not now, not ever." There was no anger in his tone, only a deep sadness that seemed to echo through the room. "You think you're helping her by pushing her toward what you believe is success? All you're doing is tearing her apart." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched her grandfather take a step forward. He looked smaller than he used to, his once broad frame now frail with age, but there was an undeniable strength in his presence. "I've kept quiet for too long," he continued, his eyes locking onto her father's. "Too many years of watching you repeat the same mistakes I made. Mistakes that nearly cost me everything." The air grew heavier, charged with unspoken memories. Clara glanced at her father, whose expression had shifted from rage to confusion. Whatever Grandpa was about to say, it clearly wasn't something they were prepared for. "When I was your age," Grandpa began, his voice softer now but still carrying the weight of conviction, "I thought I knew what success looked like. I chased after money, status, respect, all the things society told me mattered. I worked myself to the bone, sacrificing everything else along the way. My family, my health, my happiness, they all became secondary to the pursuit of something I thought would fill the void inside me." He paused, gripping his cane tighter as if bracing himself for what came next. "And you know what? It didn't work. None of it did. Because no matter how much I achieved, no matter how high I climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something irreplaceable. Something I could never get back." Clara felt her pulse quicken as she listened, her grip tightening on the recipe book. She had heard snippets of stories about Grandpa's past before, how he had built a successful business from scratch, how he had provided for their family, but never like this. Never with such raw honesty. "I pushed people away," Grandpa admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Especially the ones who mattered most. Your mother," he trailed off, glancing briefly at Clara's grandmother, who had entered the room unnoticed. She stood near the doorway, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She tried to tell me, over and over again, that I was losing sight of what truly mattered. But I didn't listen. I thought I knew better." For the first time, Clara noticed the lines etched deeply into her grandfather's face, not just the ones that came with age, but the ones carved by regret. She realized then that the man standing before them wasn't just sharing a story, he was bearing his soul. "And when I finally woke up," Grandpa continued, his gaze returning to Clara's father, "it was almost too late. I had spent so many years chasing after something hollow that I barely recognized the people I loved anymore. Your mother forgave me, thank God, but it took years to rebuild what I had broken. Years of proving to her, and to myself, that I was more than the sum of my failures." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek as she listened, her chest tight with emotion. She wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she stayed rooted to the spot, afraid to interrupt the fragile thread holding everyone together. "You see," Grandpa said, turning his attention to Clara now, his eyes softening, "your passion for baking, it's not nonsense. It's part of who you are. Just like my drive to build a business was part of me. But I let mine consume me, and look where it got me. Don't make the same mistake, sweetheart. Don't let anyone, least of all someone who claims to love you, convince you that your dreams aren't worth fighting for." His words hit Clara like a tidal wave, washing away the doubts and fears that had been building inside her for years. For so long, she had questioned whether she was good enough, whether her aspirations were valid. But hearing her grandfather defend her dreams with such unwavering certainty made her feel seen in a way she never had before. Her father, however, remained silent, his jaw clenched as if struggling to process what he was hearing. Clara could see the conflict brewing in his eyes, the stubborn pride warring with the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Grandpa took another step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When you look at Clara, do you see failure? Or do you see potential? Because I see someone who has the courage to follow her heart, even when the world tells her she shouldn't. Someone who finds joy in creating something beautiful, something that brings people together. That's not weakness, son. That's strength." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the weight of Grandpa's words settling over them like a blanket. Clara's mother finally looked up, her eyes meeting Grandpa's with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Ethan shifted again, this time sitting up straighter, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Clara's father opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, he sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. For the first time in years, there was vulnerability in his expression, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. Grandpa didn't press further. Instead, he turned back to Clara, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't stop baking, sweetheart. Keep dreaming, keep creating. And don't let anyone, tell you that you're not enough. Because you are. More than enough." As the night wore on, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of understanding. Clara clung to her grandfather's words like a lifeline, letting them anchor her amidst the storm. But even as hope flickered to life within her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would challenge not only her beliefs about herself but also the fractured relationships within her family. And somewhere deep inside, she wondered if the truth Grandpa had unveiled would be enough to mend the wounds that had festered for so long, or if the road ahead would prove even more difficult than she imagined. The days that followed Grandpa Henry's outburst were unlike any Clara had ever experienced. The house, usually filled with a tense silence or the occasional sharp exchange, now felt suspended in uncertainty. It was as though everyone was waiting for something, some kind of resolution or reckoning, but no one knew how to move forward. Clara found herself caught in the middle of it all, her emotions swinging between hope and fear like a pendulum. Her father avoided her gaze at breakfast, his usual brisk demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic quietness. He buried himself in work, leaving early in the mornings and returning late at night, his face etched with lines that seemed deeper than before. Clara couldn't help but wonder if he was avoiding her, or perhaps avoiding himself. She wanted to confront him, to ask him what he thought about Grandpa's words, but every time she opened her mouth, the courage would slip away. How could she demand answers when she wasn't even sure of her own feelings? Meanwhile, her mother began spending more time in the kitchen, hovering around Clara whenever she baked. At first, Clara assumed it was just idle curiosity, but soon she realized there was something more intentional about her mother's presence. One evening, as Clara rolled out dough for a batch of cinnamon rolls, her mother finally spoke. "You remind me of your grandmother," she said softly, leaning against the counter. Her voice carried a wistfulness that made Clara pause mid-roll. Not just because of the baking. You have her determination, her light. Clara blinked, surprised. She rarely heard her mother talk about Grandma Eleanor, who had passed away years ago. All she really knew about her was through stories, how she had been the heart of their family, always finding ways to bring people together. Clara had never considered herself similar to her grandmother. If anything, she often felt like the opposite. Where Grandma Eleanor had been warm and outgoing, Clara tended to retreat into herself, especially when things got difficult. "I don't think I'm very much like her," Clara murmured, resuming her task. The scent of cinnamon sugar filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of vanilla extract. "She sounds perfect." "I'm not." Her mother shook her head, her expression softening. "No one is perfect, Clara. Not even her. But she had this way of making people feel seen, understood. Like they mattered. And you do too, you just don't see it yet." Clara swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to believe her mother's words, but doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. What if she wasn't enough? What if she failed, just like everyone seemed to expect her to? The next day, while cleaning out the attic, Clara stumbled upon a box labeled Eleanor's recipes. Curiosity tugged at her, and she carefully lifted the lid, revealing stacks of yellowed papers covered in delicate handwriting. As she sifted through them, she discovered notes scrawled in the margins, reminders to try new ingredients, adjustments to cooking times, little doodles of hearts and flowers. It was as if her grandmother had poured her soul into these recipes, just as Clara did now. Tucked inside the box was a small journal, its cover worn from use. Clara opened it hesitantly, her breath catching as she recognized her grandmother's looping script. The entries weren't just about food, they were reflections on life, love, and resilience. One passage stood out. "Sometimes, we mistake criticism for truth. We let others define us, shape us, until we forget who we truly are. But here's the secret, your worth isn't determined by anyone else's opinion. It comes from within. From knowing that what you create, whether it's a meal, a memory, or simply a moment of kindness, has value because you gave it life." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she read the words over and over again. They resonated so deeply that it felt like her grandmother was speaking directly to her, across the years. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, her dreams weren't foolish after all. Maybe they were a part of her legacy, a continuation of something beautiful that had begun long before she was born. When Clara brought the journal downstairs to show Grandpa Henry, he smiled knowingly. "I thought you might find that someday," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Your grandmother always believed in you, even before you were born. She used to say you'd be the one to carry on her spirit." Carry on her spirit. The phrase echoed in Clara's mind, filling her with both awe and trepidation. Could she live up to such a legacy? More importantly, did she want to? As the weeks went by, Clara threw herself into her baking with renewed purpose. She experimented with flavors, combined techniques, and even started sketching designs for a bakery of her own, a cozy little space where people could gather, share stories, and leave feeling a little lighter than when they arrived. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would sit at the kitchen table with her notebook, jotting down ideas and dreaming of possibilities. But not everyone was supportive. While her mother encouraged her quietly, slipping articles about local bakeries into her bag or leaving encouraging notes on the fridge, her father remained distant. When he did speak to her, his tone was clipped, almost dismissive. Once, when he caught her sketching floor plans during dinner, he sighed heavily and muttered, "You're still wasting your time with this nonsense?" It stung, but Clara refused to let it break her. Instead, she channeled her frustration into her work, pouring her heart into each creation. She began entering baking competitions, submitting photos of her desserts to online communities, and slowly building a following on social media. Each small victory, a compliment from a neighbor, a positive comment on Instagram, a ribbon at a local fair, felt like proof that she was on the right path. Still, the tension between her and her father simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. One evening, after a particularly heated argument about her future, Clara stormed out of the house, tears streaming down her face. She ended up at the park, sitting on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. She scrolled through her messages, searching for someone, anyone, to talk to. That's when she saw it, a notification from a baking group she had joined months earlier. A woman named Margaret had posted a photo of her bakery, accompanied by a heartfelt message about overcoming self-doubt and pursuing her passion despite years of resistance from her family. Something about the post struck a chord with Clara, and without thinking, she sent Margaret a private message. To her surprise, Margaret responded almost immediately. Over the course of several hours, they exchanged messages, sharing their struggles and triumphs. Margaret's advice was simple but profound: don't wait for permission to chase your dreams. Sometimes, the only person standing in your way is yourself, and the voices you've internalized. Inspired, Clara returned home that night with a newfound resolve. She decided to take a bold step, applying for a grant aimed at supporting aspiring entrepreneurs. If she won, it would provide her with the funding she needed to open her bakery. The application process was daunting, requiring detailed business plans, financial projections, and essays about her vision. But Clara tackled it with the same determination she brought to her baking, staying up late into the night to refine her proposal. When she finally submitted the application, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced in years. Regardless of the outcome, she had taken control of her destiny, and that alone was empowering. However, the real test came a few weeks later, when the results were announced. Clara sat nervously at the kitchen table, her laptop open before her, her family gathered around. Even her father had reluctantly joined them, though he remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest. As the screen loaded, Clara held her breath, her heart pounding in anticipation. And then the words appeared: "Congratulations, Clara Bennett. You are one of our grant recipients." For a moment, there was silence. Then, her mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Ethan cheered loudly, jumping out of his seat. Grandpa Henry beamed, tears glistening in his eyes. But it was her father's reaction, or lack thereof, that weighed most heavily on Clara. He stood there, unmoving, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he cleared his throat and walked out of the room without saying a word. The joy Clara had felt moments earlier faltered, replaced by a familiar ache. Was it possible that nothing, not even this achievement, would ever be enough for him? That night, unable to sleep, Clara wandered downstairs and found her father sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she approached him and sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Clara said, "Dad, why can't you be happy for me?" He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and regret. "Because I don't know how," he admitted hoarsely. "I don't know how to let go of the idea of who I thought you should be." His honesty caught Clara off guard, and for the first time, she saw glimpses of the man behind the harsh exterior, the man who had spent years wrestling with his own demons. In that moment, she realized that healing wouldn't come easily, for either of them. But perhaps, with time and patience, they could begin to bridge the gap between them. As dawn broke, casting golden light through the windows, Clara felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, yes, but she was ready to face it, one step, one recipe, one conversation at a time.